In this video, I'm going to show you how to draft a symmetrical cloth pad pattern from scratch. So it doesn't matter what size your pad is or what shape your wings are, if you have a flare, if you have curves, if you have straight lines, it doesn't matter. The method for drafting a cloth pad that's symmetrical is the same. These two pads are both symmetrical, so you can see that the front side and the back side are mirror images of each other. And these are the key measurements that you need to figure out for drafting a symmetrical pad. So the length of the pad is the distance from here to here. So this pad would be shorter than this pad. The width of the pad is the width over here when the wings are snapped closed. So let me just snap these wings closed. And this would be the width of this pad, and this would be the width of this pad. This is irrelevant at this point. The wing base width is this width over here. It's basically how wide or how narrow the wing is when it attaches to the body of the pad. And the snap to wing tip is this distance here from the center of the snap to the tip of the wing. And that affects how much of a fabric overlap you have when you shut the snaps. These are the measurements I chose to use. So for the length of my pad, I chose 28 centimeters, which is approximately 11 inches. For the width, I chose 6.5 centimeters, which is approximately 2.5 inches. For the wing base width, I chose 8 centimeters, which is approximately 3 inches. And for the snap to wing tip, I chose 2 centimeters or 0.75 or 3/4 inch. I'm going to be working in centimeters, but you can just as easily follow along in inches. Because the pad is symmetrical, front to back and side to side, we're going to be drafting this, which is 1/4 of the pad. In order to do that, we're going to need to figure out what's half of the length and half of the width and half of the wing base width, which is pretty easy to do. You just take these three measurements and halve them. And I'm just going to write half over here. And so half of 28 centimeters is 14 centimeters. Half of 6.5 is 3.25. And half of 8 centimeters is 4 centimeters. And we don't need to have this measurement. If you're working in inches, just do the same thing. Have these three numbers, and that's the numbers you're going to be using for these key measurements. I have this fancy ruler that helps me draw perpendicular lines, but you can just as easily work with a plain ruler and use any sort of a straight edge to make sure your lines are perpendicular where they need to be. You should use a pencil when you're drafting to make it easier to erase mistakes and to have a nice, thin, precise line. I'm going to be using this thick marker just so that you see better. So we start off by drawing a straight line. And make sure that you have enough of a distance for the length of your pad. So I need 14 centimeters here, so I'm going to leave enough of a distance for myself. And at that point, you're going to draw a perpendicular line. So it's a line that's perpendicular to this one. My ruler has this marking on it that makes it easier for me to do. We're going to be drafting our pattern over here. And we're just going to be drafting this part of the pad, just 1/4 of the pad. So we're going to start by marking out the half length of the pad and the half width of the pad. So half of the length is 14 centimeters or however many inches. So I'm going to measure 14 centimeters. And I'm going to measure the width of the pad or half the width of the pad, 3.25 centimeters this way. And now I need to draw a rectangle like this. So in order to do that, I measure the 3.25 here as well and connect the two marks. And here I want to draw a perpendicular line. I can do that with my ruler. Or you could just measure 14 centimeters up here like this and connect to get perfectly perpendicular lines. So what we have here is basically 1/4 of the length and width of the pad without any curves at this time. So now we're gonna draw or draft the wings. So the snap has to sit in the center, and when the snap is closed, the width has to be this width. And that's why the distance between the center of the snap and the edge of the pad is the same as this distance here, the half width of the pad. And so what we're gonna do is mark 3.25 centimeters or whatever measurement we have over here for half the width of the pad in this direction. And this is where our snap is gonna be. So I'm gonna write snap over here. And now on top of that, we need to add the snap to wing tip measurement, which is 2 centimeters. So it would be this measurement here, the overlap of fabric that we have after the center of the snap. So I'm measuring 2 centimeters from here to here. And this is the tip of the wing. And now we need to measure out where the wing attaches to the body. So whether it goes like this or whether it goes like this. And we decided to use 4 centimeters for half of that. So we're gonna measure 4 centimeters from here to here. So 4 centimeters and connect these two marks. And this is the finished pad in terms of its length, or half its length, half its width, and its wing, the location of the snap, and how the wing attaches to the body. So at this point, you might want to add a curve to your pad like I did here, or a flare to your pad. You can have straight lines, you can have any sort of curves or any sort of fancy shapes, and you can change the shape of the wing any way you like. So I'll first show you how I would add just a plain curve over here. I would just gently curve like this, or maybe you just want to curve the edge like this to make it look more square with rounded off edges. You can play around with it and see what you like. It's all gonna work. Let's say you wanted to make the pad flare out like this one. So what you would do is extend this line out. Let's say by an extra 4 centimeters. The more you extend, the more dramatic the flare is gonna be. And connect this dot with this one over here. So this would be the base for your flare, and then you can again adjust it by curving, adding a curve like this. And if you add the curve over here, it stays straight here and then curves. Or if you add the curve starting from here, the pad will look more rounded and not so boxy like it does here. So choose whichever shape you want your pad to have. You can also keep it just with straight lines. You can also add just a straight line like this and make it sort of like diamond shaped. You can play around with this. You can also have this line a bit more S-shaped like that. You can play around with it as much as you like. What I'm gonna do is just have a curve like this. And this is optional because you can just rely on the curve you drew by hand, but I have this set of French curve rulers that allow me to lean the ruler like this and then mark out a smooth curve. But even though I have these rulers, I like to first mark out the location of my curve just by hand, freehand with a pencil. So this purple line here is going to be our stitching line. So I'm going to write that down here, which means that we can't cut the fabric along this line. We need more fabric or seam allowance all around. If you want, you can add a seam allowance to your pattern, like I showed you in another video. But in this case, I'm going to make a pattern without the seam allowance included. And this is no longer relevant to our pad. This was just to assist us in constructing the pad. And now what I'm going to do is draft the core. So the way that the core is drafted is we ignore the wing and we measure inward from the fold and around here. So I measure inward 7 millimeters. So I make lots of marks at 7 millimeters away from this fold and at 7 millimeters away from this line and along the curve as well. And then I connect the lines. So wherever the line is straight, I use a ruler. And wherever the line is curved, I either just freehand it or use this French curve. And you just want to make sure that when the line meets the center, it's perpendicular so that you have a continuous line here and not something like that or like that when you copy this over to the other side. So again, this outer line is our stitching line, and this inner line is our core. So I'm just going to write core over here. This is the location of our snap. This is the fold where the wing would fold over, and then this would be the center of the pad. So now we need to take this quarter pattern and convert it into a full pattern for the topper and backer and a full separate pattern for the core. So the way I like to do it is using tracing paper, but you could also cut this thing out and use that as a template for drawing out the whole pattern piece. But I'll show you how I do it using tracing paper. So I give myself enough room so that I have enough room for the full pattern piece. And I tape down the tracing paper onto the paper itself so that they don't shift in relation to one another. And I start off, again, do this in pencil, not in marker. I start off by drawing this center line and this perpendicular line. And I make sure that they're aligned properly with this center line and perpendicular line of the pattern. And now I'm going to trace just the stitching line. So wherever you have straight lines, use your ruler to trace them. And wherever you have curves, trace them carefully by hand or using a French curve ruler. So we've traced a quarter of the pattern, and now I'm going to flip this over, take the tape off, flip this over, and align this crosshair with the pattern underneath, tape it back down, and trace the same line again. Now when I trace this part, I forgot to mark out the snap, but I'm going to do it this time to mark out where the snap is, and if you want, you can also mark out where the fold is. So we traced out half of the pattern piece, and we do the exact same thing to trace out the other half. Just make sure that you're aligning this line and this line with these lines here. So this would be our finished pattern piece for the topper and the backer of the pad. And just remember that this pattern has no seam allowance added to it. So this is the stitching line, not the cutting line. And you're going to need to add a seam allowance all the way around if you want, or use the pattern as is and cut the fabric further away from this pattern line. So what I like to do, just to be tidy, is to write that this is my pad number 1 pattern, so that if I make other pads, I can remember which is which. So this is my pad number 1 pattern, and this is also related to it, pad 1. And I'm gonna write no seam allowance in this pattern. Need to add when cutting. So this would be our pattern piece for the topper and backer. We just need to cut it out. And if you want to have it on a thicker piece of paper or a piece of cardboard, you can just paste this down and then cut around this line. So here's our pattern piece all cut out for our topper and backer fabric. Now the last thing we need to do is trace out a pattern piece for the core. And we do that in the same way that we did the topper and backer. I tape down my tracing paper and I'm gonna trace the core line, and then I'm gonna flip the paper over and trace all the way so that I get a full pattern piece. Again, I'm starting with the crosshairs so that I have that as a reference for when I align the paper in order to trace. And when I trace straight lines, I do that with the ruler, and curved lines with this. And I write core and I write pad 1 so that I know that this is associated with this. So there's our core pattern piece, and now I'm just going to cut it out. And that's it, we're done. We have our topper and backer pattern piece and our core pattern piece ready to cut out and sew. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And I'd appreciate it if you left a comment letting me know if this helped you. And if you have any other requests for videos relating to sewing cloth pads, I'd be happy to make them. Just let me know what you'd find useful.